I am Anna Jones, 18 years old. Sitting in the U.S. Army barracks today, I suddenly remembered my first survival mission at the age of 11. My parents packed their suitcases for a month-long trip to Europe, throwing me exactly $20 and a locked credit card. My mother pointed her finger at my face and said, "Don't ruin our trip with that pathetic look. $20 is more than enough for a useless brat who only knows how to spend money like you." They spent $47,000 on wine and five-star hotels, while I had to learn how to split a package of ramen noodles in half to keep from starving. They thought I would stay silent and collapse. But they didn't know that I recorded every single moment they left me in the dark. An ambush they never expected was waiting for them the moment they stepped back inside the house. Please let me know where you are watching from. Press subscribe if you believe that. In the military or in the family, abandoning a teammate is an unforgivable crime. The house in suburban Denver always smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, especially when the real estate agents were coming over or when my mother, Diane, was about to go live on Instagram. It was a beautiful two-story craftsman with a perfectly manicured lawn and a porch swing that looked like it belonged on a postcard. But for me, that house never felt like a home. It felt like a stage set. I was just an uncredited extra in the movie of Diane Jones's Perfect Life. My father, Greg, was the lead supporting actor who had long ago forgotten his lines and just followed whatever direction she gave. That morning, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and designer perfume. Diane was in her element, flitting between her massive walk-in closet and the 3 Toomey suitcases splayed open on the mahogany bed. She was packing for Paris, a month of wine, art, and 5-star hotels. I stood in the doorway, my 11-year-old hands tucked into the pockets of my oversized hoodie, watching her fold a silk scarf with more care than she had ever shown me. I felt invisible, a piece of old furniture that did not fit the new aesthetic of her European getaway. She did not look up when she spoke. Her voice was sharp, like a glass shard hidden in a velvet cushion. "Anna, stop standing there looking like a Victorian orphan. You are ruining my mood." She finally turned around, her eyes scanning me with a mix of annoyance and disdain. She walked over to the kitchen island and tossed 2 $10 bills onto the marble surface. They fluttered there, looking pathetically small against the vast expanse of white stone. "There," she said. "That is your spending money for the month. Do not go wasting it on candy." I stared at the $20. $20 for 30 days, in Denver. Even at 11, I knew the math did not add up. "Mom," I started, my voice small and trembling. "That is not even enough for—" She cut me off with a sharp wave of her hand. "We have left plenty of food in the pantry, Anna. Stop being so dramatic. It is just a month. You need to learn some independence. You are always so needy, just like your grandmother." Then she pulled a silver credit card from her wallet and placed it next to the cash. "This is for emergencies only, and I mean real emergencies. If the house catches fire, you call the fire department first, then you use this if you have to. Do not call us. We will be in a different time zone, and I do not want our trip ruined by your petty complaints." My father, Greg, walked in then, checking his watch. "The Uber is here, Diane," he said. He did not look at me. He never did when Diane was in one of her moods. It was easier for him to look at the floor or his phone or the wall. Anything but the daughter he was leaving behind. "Dad?" I whispered. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand gripping the handle of a suitcase. He looked at me then, but his eyes were hollow. "Just listen to your mother, Anna. Be a good girl. We will be back before you know it." He turned and walked out the door without a single hug, without a backward glance. He was a soldier of her will, and he had just deserted his post. The sound of the front door clicking shut echoed through the house like a gunshot. Then came the silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that settled into every corner of the rooms. I stood there for a long time, staring at those 2 $10 bills. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. It was not just fear. It was the realization that I was truly on my own. In the military, they have a code. Leave no man behind. It is the ultimate promise of loyalty. But in this house, the only code was Diane's ego, and I had been left behind in the most brutal way possible. I tried to be brave. I walked to the pantry, hoping to find the mountain of food she mentioned. It was mostly half-empty boxes of quinoa, some stale crackers, and a few cans of soup that had expired a year ago. She had not gone grocery shopping in weeks. She was too busy planning her outfits for Paris. By the time evening rolled around, the $20 felt like a joke, and the pantry felt like a graveyard. My stomach was growling, a persistent ache that would not go away. I looked at the silver credit card. My breath hitched. She said emergencies only, but surely being an 11-year-old with no food counted as an emergency. I picked up the house phone and dialed the local pizza place. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the receiver. I ordered a small cheese pizza and a bottle of water. When the man asked for the card number, I read it out, feeling like I was committing a crime. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I am sorry, kid," the man on the other end said after a moment of silence. "The transaction was declined." I tried a second time, but it says the card has not been activated or there is a block on it. "Do you have another way to pay?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "No," I whispered. "I do not." I hung up the phone and slumped onto the kitchen floor. The silver card lay there on the cold tile, mocking me. It was not a life raft. It was a lead weight. They had not just left me with no money, they had ensured I had no way to help myself. I realized then that the emergency card was just another prop. It was something they could tell themselves to feel like they were not total monsters. We left her a card they would say to their friends over wine in a Parisian cafe. She was perfectly safe. But the reality was staring at me from the dark corners of the empty house. I was 11 years old, starving, and abandoned in a fortress of fake luxury. This was not a vacation for them. It was a survival test for me. And as I looked at the $20 on the counter, I knew I had to find a way to make it through the night. I did not know then that this was the start of a much larger battle, one where I would have to learn to be my own army, my own commander, and my own savior. Because the people who were supposed to protect me were the ones who had thrown me into the line of fire. The silence in that big house in Denver was not a new visitor. It was an old friend, one that had been sitting in the corners of my room since I was old enough to hold a crayon. As I sat on the cold kitchen floor with that useless silver card, my mind began to drift back, mapping out the scars that led me to this moment. People often ask how a mother could leave her 11-year-old daughter with $20 and a locked card. But if they knew our history, they would realize it was not a sudden lapse in judgment. It was the logical conclusion of years of calculated neglect. My mother did not see a daughter when she looked at me. She saw a flawed prop that ruined her lighting. I grew up in the shadow of the perfect squad. That was what Diane called us in her hashtags. She was obsessed with the idea of a curated, color-coordinated family that looked like it jumped out of a high-end catalog. We had the matching flannel shirts for the fall pumpkin patch photos and the white linen outfits for the beach trips we never actually enjoyed because we were too busy posing. In those photos, Diane and Greg looked like the pinnacle of American parenting, radiant and deeply in love with their life. But look closer at the edges of those frames. Usually, I was the one holding the camera, my small hands shaking as I tried to get the perfect angle for Diane's profile. If I was allowed in the shot, I was often cropped out later or relegated to the far background. She said I looked too pale, that my skin tone washed out the vibrant filters she loved, or that my expression was too gloomy. I was the glass child, the one she looked right through because I was not shiny enough to reflect her own vanity. By the time I was 8, I'd already mastered the discipline of being ignored. While other kids were having their shoelaces tied or their crusts cut off their sandwiches, I was standing on a stool to reach the stove, making my own scrambled eggs. Diane called it raising an independent woman. She would brag to her followers about how self-reliant her little girl was, painting her neglect as a progressive parenting style. In reality, she just could not be bothered to put down her phone. I learned to sign my own permission slips for school, mimicking her loopy handwriting so well that the teachers never suspected a thing. I remember one morning specifically when I asked her what grade I was entering that year. She paused, her thumb hovering over the edit button on a photo of her avocado toast, and she actually had to think about it. She did not know. To her, I was just a ghost in the hallway of her digital museum. There was always a comparison waiting to sting me. Why can you not be more like the Miller girl? Diane would sigh, looking at the neighbor's daughter who did ballet and wore pink bows. I would just stand there, silent, watching her. She took my silence for stupidity or some kind of developmental delay. She did not realize that my silence was actually the sound of a child's heart freezing over. I was absorbing everything, recording every dismissive glance and every cold remark. I was not slow. I was observing the enemy. I was learning that in this house, my value was zero unless I could contribute to her brand. Since I refused to smile on cue or act like a living doll, I was written out of the script entirely. The breaking point of my childhood happened on a Tuesday. I remember the heat radiating from my skin, a fever so high that the air in my room felt like it was vibrating. My head throbbed with every heartbeat, and I could barely swallow. My father, Greg, actually noticed for once. He came into my room and put a hand on my forehead, his face flickering with a momentary flash of genuine concern. He told Diane we needed to go to the urgent care. But Diane was already dressed in a flowing sundress, her makeup perfect for a sunset photo shoot she'd spent weeks organizing with a local photographer. She looked at me not with pity, but with pure resentment. She told him I was just being dramatic to get attention. She said a doctor visit would take hours and ruin the golden hour lighting they needed. So they left. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of their laughter drifting in from the backyard as they posed for the camera. I felt so small, so utterly disposable. In that darkness, a verse I had heard in Sunday school came back to me. Even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will hold me close. I am not sure if I believed in God that night, but I started to believe in myself. I made a silent vow to that empty, dark room. I swore that one day I would never let anyone leave me behind again. I realized that my worth was not tied to their approval or their Instagram likes. I was more than a prop. I was a person, even if I was the only one who knew it. I realized then that if I was ever going to survive, I had to be my own protector. I began to understand that when your own parents treat you like you are invisible, you have to become your own light. I started wondering, if I was not the one to stand up for myself, then who would? No one was coming to save the girl in the dark room. I had to learn to save myself. I am telling you this because I know some of you have felt like that invisible child too. You have felt the weight of being ignored in your own home. If this story touches your heart or reminds you of your own strength, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us reach more people who need to know they are not alone. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Just type the word brave if you have ever had to be your own hero. Your support means everything as we continue Anna's journey. The two $10 bills felt like heavy weights in my pocket as I stood in the middle of that silent, oversized kitchen. I had always been good at math, but I had never had to use it to calculate the price of my own life before. $20, 30 days. The equation was simple and brutal. 66 cents a day. I looked at the vast empty granite island where my mother had tossed the money, and then I looked at the pantry. I felt like a prisoner of war being given a final, meager ration before the guards walked away. My stomach was already tight with a knot of anxiety that felt a lot like hunger, even though I had eaten breakfast just a few hours before. I opened the refrigerator, and the hum of the cooling system seemed to mock me. Inside, there was half a container of plain yogurt, 4 eggs, and a jar of mustard. That was it. My parents had spent $47,000 to fly across an ocean and sleep in silk sheets, and they had left their only child with enough money to buy a single pack of gum a day. I realized then that I was entering a survival mission, and my first duty was to manage my resources with the precision of a commanding officer. The walk to the local Walmart was 2 miles. Under the Colorado summer sun, that distance felt like a trek across the desert. I was 11 years old, walking along the side of the road because our suburban neighborhood did not have sidewalks that went all the way to the commercial district. I kept my hand pressed against my pocket, making sure those 2 bills were still there. Every car that passed by felt like a witness to my shame. I wondered if the people driving by in their air-conditioned SUVs could see that I was a girl on the brink of starvation. By the time I reached the store, my shirt was damp with sweat and my legs were aching. The blast of cold air from the automatic doors should have felt good, but it just made me shiver. I felt exposed. I felt like everyone could tell that I only had $20 to my name. I grabbed a small handbasket, but it felt too large for what I was about to buy. I headed straight for the aisle with the instant noodles. It was a place I'd never really visited before. Diane usually bought organic, gluten-free, high-end groceries that looked good in her kitchen photos. But organic food was a luxury for people who were not counting their cents. I stood in front of the shelves of ramen for a long time. I was doing mental gymnastics with the numbers. A 12-pack was nearly $4. That was 6 days of food if I was careful. I looked at the different flavors, but they did not really matter. I just needed the calories. I felt the eyes of a store employee on me, a woman in a blue vest who was restocking the shelves. I tried to look like I was just running an errand for my mom, but my clothes were wrinkled and my hair was a mess from the walk. I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me as I counted out the change in my hand. I ended up buying 2 12-packs and a large loaf of the cheapest white bread they had. When I got to the checkout, the total came to $9.42. I watched the cashier slide my 2 $10 bills into the drawer, and it felt like I was watching my lifeblood drain away. I walked back home carrying those plastic bags, the handles digging into my palms. My body was tired, but my mind was starting to harden. I remembered a phrase I'd heard once about military training: improvise, adapt, and overcome. I did not have a choice. I had to become someone else to survive this month. Back at the house, I established a strict regime. I was not just a kid anymore, I was a quartermaster. I took the ramen packs out and lined them up on the counter. I decided that I would split each pack in half for lunch, half for dinner. For breakfast, I would have 1 slice of dry bread. I spent the afternoon cleaning the kitchen, scrubbing away any trace of my parents' presence. I needed the house to feel like a base, not a graveyard of memories. When evening fell, the hunger started to become a physical presence. It was not just a growl in my stomach, it was a dull ache in my bones. I boiled the water and dropped in the half-brick of noodles. I watched them soften in the pot, my mouth watering. I ate slowly, forcing myself to chew every single strand, trying to make the meal last as long as possible. When the bowl was empty, I drank all the salty water that was left. It filled my stomach for a moment, but within an hour, the emptiness was back. I realized that the hardest part of this mission was going to be the nights. The darkness made the house feel cavernous, and the silence made the hunger louder. I crawled into bed and drank 2 large glasses of tap water, hoping to drown out the cravings. I forced myself to close my eyes, telling myself that every hour I slept was an hour I did not have to feel hungry. I could not just sit there and fade away, though. I needed a record. I needed to document what was happening, mostly so I would not lose my mind. I found my old iPad in the bottom of my toy chest. It was cracked and the battery did not last long, but it still worked. I set it up on the kitchen counter and hit the record button. My face on the screen looked different. My eyes were wider, and the soft roundness of my cheeks was already starting to give way to something sharper. My voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath it that I could not hide. I held up the half-brick of dry noodles to the camera. "This is day 3, I said to the empty room. "My parents are currently in Paris. They are probably having dinner at a bistro right now. Meanwhile, I am learning how to live on 66 cents a day. I do not think they realize that when they left me here, they started a clock. I am not sure what happens when it runs out, but I am recording everything." I turned off the iPad and sat in the dark for a while. I was tired and everything hurt. But for the first time in my life, I felt a strange sense of power. They had tried to make me invisible, but I was making sure that I was seen, even if it was only by a camera lens. I was surviving, and that was the greatest act of defiance I could manage. By the 7th day, the hunger had changed. It was no longer a sharp, clawing thing in my gut. It had become a heavy, dull fog that settled in my bones and made my head feel light, like a balloon tethered to my shoulders by a very thin string. I was sitting on the floor of the darkened living room. the only light coming from the cracked screen of my iPad as I recorded another entry. My voice sounded thin and papery, like old leaves rustling in the wind. I was explaining to the camera how the bread had started to grow blue spots of mold and how I was trying to decide if it was safer to eat around them or just go without. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, a small shadow moving through a house that was built for people who actually existed. The silence of the neighborhood was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing car that never stopped for me. Then there was a sound that didn't belong in my world of silence, a knock. It was firm but gentle, 3 distinct taps on the heavy oak front door. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My first instinct was to hide. Diane had spent years telling me that I was a burden, a problem, something to be kept out of sight. I was terrified that someone had finally realized I was alone and that I would get in trouble for it. But the knock came again, followed by a voice I recognized. "Anna? It is Mr. Harold from next door. Are you in there, honey?" Mr. Harold was a retired widower who spent most of his time meticulously tending to his rose bushes. He was the kind of man who always wore a clean flannel shirt and smelled faintly of peppermint and cedar shavings. I slowly opened the door, just a crack. The light from the porch felt blinding. Mr. Harold was standing there, holding a large white plate covered with aluminum foil. The smell hit me before I could even see his face properly. It was the scent of slow-cooked garlic, rich tomato sauce, and dried oregano. It was the smell of life. My eyes filled with tears so fast it made my vision blur. He looked down at me, his bushy eyebrows knitting together in concern as he took in my disheveled hair and the way my oversized clothes seemed to hang off my frame. "Anna," he said, his voice raspy and deep, "I haven't seen your folks' car in a week, and I noticed the lights haven't been on much. Is everything okay?" I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, the first sob escaping my throat before I could stop it. He didn't ask any more questions right then. He just stepped inside, placed the warm plate on the counter, and led me to the kitchen table. The spaghetti was hot and thick, the kind of meal that felt like a hug from the inside out. As I ate, shoving the pasta into my mouth with a desperation that made my hands shake, Mr. Harold sat across from me. He didn't look away, and he didn't judge. He just watched me with a quiet, burning intensity in his eyes. "Where are they, Anna?" he asked softly. I swallowed a mouthful of sauce and whispered that they were in Paris. I told him about the $20 and the silver card that wouldn't work. I saw his jaw tighten, a vein in his forehead bulging slightly, but his voice remained steady. He pushed a glass of water toward me and told me to use his phone. He said it was time I talked to my mother. Sitting in Mr. Harold's warm, cluttered kitchen, I dialed the international number I'd memorized but had been too afraid to call. The ringing sound was different, a long rhythmic drone that seemed to bridge the gap between my dark reality and their bright fantasy. When the line finally picked up, I didn't hear a worried mother. I heard the upbeat swell of a live jazz band and the sophisticated clinking of crystal glasses. The sound of laughter, bright and expensive, drifted through the receiver. "Hello?" Diane's voice was melodic, light, and utterly unbothered. "Mom," I choked out, my voice breaking. "It's me." "Mom, I'm so hungry. The card doesn't work, and I ran out of money days ago. Please, I don't know what to do." The silence on the other end lasted only a second before it was replaced by a cold, sharp hiss of air. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Anna," she snapped, her tone shifting from socialite to executioner in a heartbeat. "Are you really doing this right now? We are in the middle of a beautiful dinner with the Martins. I told you specifically not to call with your petty little dramas. I gave you more than enough money. If you spent it all on junk in the first week, that is a lesson in responsibility you clearly needed to learn. Stop being so manipulative. You are not starving. You are just being difficult because you want to ruin this for me." I started to cry, real, gasping sobs that made it hard to breathe. "Mom, please, I'm not lying. Mr. Harold is right here. He had to feed me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "You brought a neighbor into this. How dare you embarrass us like that? You stay in that house and you stop telling lies to the neighbors. We will talk about your behavior when we get back." Do not call this number again." The line went dead with a hollow, mechanical click. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a void opening up in my chest that no amount of spaghetti could ever fill. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. A stranger had seen my pain from across a fence, but my own mother had heard my cries from across an ocean and chose to hang up. I looked at Mr. Harold, expecting him to look away in embarrassment, but he didn't. He reached across the table and placed his large, calloused hand over mine. His eyes weren't full of pity. They were full of a fierce, protective anger. "Listen to me, Anna," he said, his voice like iron. "Family isn't always about the people who share your blood. Sometimes it is about the people who show up when the lights go out. You are not alone. Do you hear me?" He walked me back to my house but made me promise to come over every morning for breakfast and every evening for dinner. But before he left, he looked at the iPad sitting on the counter. He pointed to it and said something that changed the way I looked at my situation. He told me that my words were my shield. He told me to keep recording, to keep writing everything down, and to save every bit of evidence of what was happening. He said that the truth was the only thing they couldn't edit or filter out. For the first time, I stopped feeling like a victim, waiting to be rescued. I felt like a witness preparing for a day of reckoning. I realized that while Diane was busy building her fake heaven in Paris, I was building something real right here in the shadows. I was learning that I didn't need her light to see. I had found a different kind of warmth, and I had found the one thing she feared most: someone who finally believed me. The blue light from my iPad screen was the only thing illuminating the kitchen, casting long, skeletal shadows against the designer cabinets that Diane loved so much. By the second week, the hunger had stopped being a sharp pain and had settled into a dull, heavy throb, a constant companion that whispered to me every time I moved. I was sitting there, nursing a glass of lukewarm tap water to trick my stomach into thinking it was full, when the phone rang. It was an international call. The caller ID showed a location in the Mediterranean. I hesitated, my heart fluttering with a tiny, pathetic spark of hope. Maybe she had realized. Maybe the guilt had finally found her on whatever luxury yacht she was currently occupying. I answered with a whispered hello, my voice cracking from disuse. There was no inquiry about my health. There was no question about whether I had enough to eat or if I was scared. Instead, the airwaves were filled with the sound of wind whipping past a high-end microphone and the distant, rhythmic splashing of waves against a hull. Diane's voice came through sharp and biting, cutting through the thousands of miles like a serrated blade. She didn't ask how I was. She started screaming about the house. She had checked the smart home cameras, or perhaps she was just projecting her own neuroses, but she was furious that I hadn't deep-cleaned the guest suite. She told me she had arranged for a virtual check-in from a woman she called Mrs. Johnson, some person from an agency who was supposed to be my remote nanny. And Diane didn't want her complaining about a messy house. Every word she spoke felt like a needle pressing into my raw nerves. I tried to tell her again that the silver card was useless, that I was lightheaded and couldn't stop shaking. But she cut me off. She called me an entitled, spoiled brat. She told me she had left me a small fortune in that silver card, and that if I was hungry, it was because I was too lazy to go to the store or too stupid to manage my budget. She called my agony a cry for attention and my starvation a choice. Then, she hung up to go back to her sundowners on the deck. Later that night, I found myself scrolling through her Instagram feed. It was a form of self-torture, I suppose, but I couldn't stop. There she was, glowing under the warm lights of a Michelin-starred restaurant in Rome. She was holding a glass of deep red wine, her hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a dress that probably cost more than a year of my school tuition. The caption read, "It brings me so much peace of mind to know my dear daughter is being well cared for at home while we take this much-needed time to reconnect." Family is everything. I stared at the screen, watching the likes climb. 1,000, 5,000, 12,000. Hundreds of people were commenting, calling her an inspiration and a wonderful, devoted mother. I looked down at my own hands, pale and thin, clutching a glass of water because I had finished my half ration of ramen hours ago. I realized then that the woman in the photo didn't exist. The Diane Jones the world loved was a digital ghost, a carefully constructed lie designed to harvest validation from strangers, while the real person behind the screen was busy destroying her own child. This was digital abuse in its purest form, using a platform to bury my voice under a mountain of filtered perfection. My father, Greg, sent a text message a few hours later. It was short and devoid of any real substance. It just said, "Anna, please stop upsetting your mother. You know how stressed she gets on these trips. Just do what she says and keep the house clean. We will talk when we are home." He was a deserter. He had abandoned his post as a protector long ago, choosing the path of least resistance rather than standing up to the whirlwind of narcissism that was his wife. He saw me as a complication, a variable that threatened his quiet life of submission. I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, barely recognizing the girl staring back. My eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles that looked like bruises. My skin was sallow, stretched tight over my cheekbones and ribs. I had lost 9 pounds in less than 2 weeks. I looked like a prisoner of war, a tiny captive in a suburban fortress of glass and stone. But something was shifting inside me. The UAT and the sadness were being replaced by a cold, hard sense of purpose. I had found an old book in the library that my father had bought but never read, something about extreme ownership and discipline. It talked about how, in the absence of a leader, you must become your own. It talked about taking total responsibility for your environment, no matter how unfair it might be. I realized that if I remained a victim, I would surely break. But if I became a soldier, I might just survive. I went back to the kitchen and opened my iPad. I didn't cry this time. I started a spreadsheet. I recorded the date, the time of the calls, and the exact words Diane had used. I filmed myself showing the empty pantry and the declined credit card receipts. I documented the weight loss and the lethargy. I was no longer a child waiting for a mother who would never come. I was a scout gathering intelligence, building a digital dossier of the truth. I had 22 video clips now, each one a nail in the coffin of Diane's fake reputation. I was learning to find discipline in the shadows and strength in the silence. Diane thought she was controlling me from across the world. But she didn't realize that by leaving me with nothing, she had accidentally given me the only thing that could destroy her: the absolute necessity to fight back. I sat in the dark, watching the last of the ramen broth dry in the bottom of the bowl. And I knew that the next time they saw me, I wouldn't be the daughter they remembered. I would be the consequence of everything they had done. The sound of the chalk against the blackboard used to be a steady rhythm in my life, a predictable beat that meant I was safe in the middle of a crowd. But that Tuesday, the sound began to drift away, becoming a faint, distant tapping that felt like it was coming from another room entirely. The hunger was no longer a sharp, clawing pain in my stomach. It had transformed into a hollow, echoing emptiness that seemed to occupy my entire mind, leaving no room for algebra or geometry. I remember staring at a complex equation on the board, the numbers blurring and dancing until they looked like swarms of tiny black insects. I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead, and the air in the classroom suddenly felt too thick to breathe. When I leaned forward to catch my breath, the world simply tilted. I didn't feel the impact when I hit the cold linoleum floor. The last thing I remember thinking wasn't a fear for my life, but a paralyzing dread of what Diane would say when she found out I had caused a scene and tarnished the perfect reputation she worked so hard to maintain. The transition back to consciousness was marked by a sound I will never forget. The long, rhythmic wail of an ambulance siren pierced through the fog in my brain, dragging me back to a reality I wasn't ready to face. I was lying in the school clinic, the harsh fluorescent lights above me humming with an intensity that made my head throb. Mrs. Patterson, my math teacher, was sitting nearby, her face pale and her eyes brimming with a worry I hadn't seen in a long time. The school nurse, a kind woman with gentle hands, was leaning over me. As she began to lift my oversized sweater to place the stethoscope against my chest, I heard her breath hitch. It was a small broken sound, a gasp of pure shock as she saw the outline of my ribs pressing sharply against my skin. In that moment, the secret I had been keeping for weeks was laid bare under the clinical lights of the infirmary. I saw the pity in their eyes, and it felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to tell them I was okay, to make up some lie about a stomach flu. But the words wouldn't come. My body had finally spoken the truth that my voice had been too terrified to utter. By the time evening rolled around, I was back in the silence of my dark house, clutching my iPad with trembling fingers. A notification flashed on the screen, a call coming in from Santorini. I felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. When I answered, there was no gentle inquiry about my health. There was no relief in Diane's voice. Instead, her words came through like a serrated blade, cold and filled with a terrifying, controlled fury. "You calculated, manipulative little demon," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a hatred that chilled me to the bone. "You did this on purpose. You staged that little performance in front of your teachers just to humiliate me, didn't you? You wanted to make sure everyone thought I was a monster while I'm away. I told you I left you money. I told you to be responsible. And instead, you choose to play the victim so you can ruin the only time I felt happy in years." Her accusations were so far removed from reality that for a moment, I couldn't even process them. She wasn't seeing a starving child. She was seeing a threat to her digital kingdom. The threat that followed was the one that finally killed the last lingering spark of childhood innocence within me. "Listen to me very carefully, Anna," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, menacing crawl that felt like a snake tightening around my neck. "If you say one more word to those teachers, or if the police or Child Protective Services show up at my door because of your lies, I promise you that you will never see the inside of this house again. I will have you packed off to a boarding school so remote and so strict that you will forget what freedom feels like. You will be alone, truly alone, and you will stay there until you learn how to be grateful for the life we've given you. Do you understand me? You will tell them you are fasting for a school project, or you will tell them you've been sick, but you will not mention this trip again." I heard a heavy sigh in the background, a weary, defeated sound that I knew belonged to my father. He was right there, listening to her threaten to disappear his only daughter, and he said nothing. His silence was the final stamp on my death warrant, a clear signal that there was no one left in that family who would stand up for me. In that moment, something shifted in the very foundation of my soul. The girl who used to hope for a hug or a kind word from her parents died right there on that kitchen floor. I looked at the image on my screen, a photo of them laughing under a vibrant Greek sunset, holding glasses of wine and looking like the picture of happiness. I realized then that they weren't my parents anymore. They were hostage takers who had left me in a cage of glass and iron, and they were willing to let me starve to protect the lie of their perfection. The fear that had paralyzed me for years began to transform into something sharper, something colder. It was a survival instinct that I recognized from the stories of the soldiers I admired. I realized that the truth wasn't just a burden, it was a weapon. I wasn't going to be the invisible child who faded away in a dark room. I was going to be the witness they couldn't silence. I sat there in the dark, watching the moon rise over the suburban rooftops, and I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. Diane thought she could threaten me into submission with the fear of being alone, but she didn't realize that I had already been alone for a very long time. She had already given me the worst she had to offer, and I was still breathing. I picked up my iPad and opened the camera. I didn't look like the girl in her Instagram photos anymore. I looked like a survivor. I began to speak to the lens, my voice steady and clear, recording the details of the call, the boarding school threat, and the silence of my father. I was activating my final defense. They had declared war on the truth, but they had forgotten one thing. I was the only one who lived in reality. I was done being a prop. I was ready to be the consequence of their cruelty. I am sharing my story with you because I know how much it hurts to be threatened for telling the truth. I know the terror of realizing the people who should love you are the ones you need to fear the most. If you have ever felt like you had to find a hidden strength just to survive the day, please like this video and subscribe to Stay With Me. It helps me know that my voice is finally being heard. I want you to go to the comments right now and just type the word brave if you believe that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Your support is the shield I never had growing up. Karen Oyalaran did not walk into our home like a guest. And she certainly did not act like the investigators you see on television who are easily swayed by a nice neighborhood and a manicured lawn. She arrived with the quiet, unshakable authority of a high-ranking officer entering a disaster zone. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes that seemed to record every detail before she even spoke a word. She didn't comment on the beautiful architecture of our Denver craftsmen or the expensive scent of the candles that Diane always kept lit. Instead, she walked straight past the velvet sofas and the designer rugs, heading directly for the kitchen. I watched her from the hallway, my heart hammering a rhythmic beat against my ribs. When she opened the refrigerator and saw nothing but a pile of crumpled ramen wrappers and a carton of milk that had curdled into a sour, lumpy mess, her jaw tightened. She turned to look at me, and for the first time in 22 days, I saw a look of genuine, unfiltered, protective anger. She didn't ask me how my day was, or if I liked my school. She looked me in the eyes and asked a single, life-changing question. Anna, do you want to be safe? It was the evacuation order I'd been dreaming of, the signal that my time behind enemy lines was finally over. As the evening sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the marble kitchen island, Karen sat me down and produced a stack of papers that felt heavier than they looked. They were bank statements. She had obtained an emergency subpoena earlier that afternoon, and the numbers on those pages were like a map of my parents' betrayal. I stared at the lines of text, my eyes stinging as the reality of their trip was laid bare. $15,000 for a single Hermes handbag purchased in a boutique on the Champs-Élysées. $8,000 for a 3-night stay in a luxury suite overlooking the Seine. The total expenditure for their first 3 weeks in Europe was $47,312. They were living like luxury royalty, indulging in every whim, while I was walking 2 miles under a scorching sun to buy a loaf of bread with 66 cents. But the most devastating piece of evidence was not the spending. It was a single line at the bottom of the credit card report regarding the silver card they had left for me. It was marked with a status code that made my blood run cold. Locked unauthorized. It wasn't that they had forgotten to activate it. They had gone into their banking app and manually placed a block on the card before they even left for the airport. It was a deliberate, calculated move to ensure I was helpless. I felt a strange sense of clarity as I looked at those numbers. The resentment and the suffocating bitterness that had been weighing me down for weeks finally began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, tactical resolve. I led Karen upstairs to my bedroom, where I reached under the floorboard of my closet and pulled out my old, cracked iPad. "This is everything," I told her, my voice steady for the first time. I handed her the device, which contained the 22 video entries I'd recorded in the dark. It was the black box of my survival mission. I watched her face as she scrolled through the clips. She saw me breaking the dry noodle bricks to make them last another day. She heard the sound of Diane screaming through the speaker, threatening to send me to a remote boarding school while the sound of champagne glasses clinked in the background. She saw the physical toll the weeks had taken on me, the way my face had thinned and my eyes had sunken into my skull. When she finished the last video, she looked at me with a profound sense of respect that I had never received from my own blood. "You did an incredible job, Anna," she whispered. "You didn't just survive. You gathered the intelligence you needed to save yourself. You are the most resilient young woman I have ever met." But the struggle was far from over. Late that night, as I sat in the guest room of the temporary shelter Karen had arranged for me, a final email from Diane arrived. It was filled with a new kind of desperation, a frantic attempt to regain control of a narrative that was slipping through her fingers. She told me that she had heard about the school incident and that if I didn't immediately retract my statements and tell the school that I was suffering from a mental breakdown, she would have me committed to a psychiatric ward. She said she would tell everyone that I had a history of lying and that I had stolen money from them before they left. She called me a danger to myself and told me that no one would ever believe a troubled child over a respected member of the community. It was a declaration of total war, a final attempt to bury the truth under a mountain of slander. I didn't cry when I read her words. I didn't feel the paralyzing fear that used to take hold of me whenever she raised her voice. I simply placed my iPad on the bedside table, propped it up against a lamp, and hit the record button one last time. I read her email out loud, my voice calm and clear, letting the camera capture every word of her cruel threats. "I am not lying, Mom," I said to the lens, speaking directly to the woman who was currently thousands of miles away in a world of luxury. "I have the receipts. I have the bank statements. I have the videos of every time you chose your ego over my life. And most importantly, I have people who finally see you for who you really are. I am done protecting your image. I am done being the ghost in your house. The truth is out now, and it is a fact that never misses its mark." I hit the save button and felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had been carrying for years. I was no longer a victim waiting for a rescue that might never come. I was the architect of my own justice, and I was ready for the final confrontation. The house was glowing that night, a beacon of artificial warmth in our quiet Denver suburb. Diane had spared no expense for their welcome home celebration, and the air was filled with the scent of expensive catering and the kind of high-end floral arrangements that only exist to signal status. I watched from across the fence, sitting in the quiet shadows of Mr. Harold's living room. From my vantage point, the party looked like a scene from a movie, a perfect tableau of success and sophistication. Diane was radiant in a silk dress she had picked up in Milan, her laughter ringing out like crystal chimes as she moved through the crowd of nearly 40 guests. She held a flute of vintage champagne, her diamond rings catching the light with every practiced gesture. On the massive flat-screen television in the living room, a slideshow of their European vacation played on a loop. There were photos of them kissing in front of the Eiffel Tower, sipping wine in Tuscany, and smiling on a yacht in Santorini. It was a masterpiece of digital storytelling, a curated dream designed to make everyone in that room feel small by comparison. Diane eventually gathered everyone around the large kitchen island, the very place where she had tossed those two $10 bills only a few weeks prior. Her voice was smooth and melodic as she addressed her friends and colleagues. She talked about the transformative power of travel and the deep connection she and Greg had rediscovered. And then she mentioned me. She told the crowd how much she had missed her dear Anna and how grateful she was that I had been such a brave girl. She spoke about Mrs. Johnson, the fictional caregiver she had invented to cover her tracks, describing her as a wonderful woman who had taken such excellent care of me while they were away. It was a performance of breathtaking deceit. She lied with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime believing her own fabrications. The guests nodded and smiled, murmuring about what a devoted and thoughtful mother she was. They had no idea that while they were admiring her Milanese silk, the girl she was talking about was sitting in a neighbor's house with a hollow stomach and a heart made of ice. But the mirage did not last. The front door, which had been the gateway to her sanctuary of lies, suddenly swung open with a heavy final sound. The chatter in the room died down instantly as Karen O'Yelleran stepped into the foyer, flanked by Officer Nguyen. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to confusion in a heartbeat. Diane tried to maintain her social mask, a confused but polite smile plastered on her face. She asked the officer if there was some sort of noise complaint or if they were looking for someone. But Officer Nguyen did not offer a smile in return. He stood in the center of the room, his uniform a stark contrast to the evening gowns and tailored suits, and he read the warrant with a voice that carried to every corner of the house. He charged Diane and Greg Jones with multiple counts of felony child endangerment and neglect. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of 40 people simultaneously holding their breath. I watched through the window as the champagne flute slipped from Diane's hand, the glass shattering on the marble floor into 1,000 jagged pieces. It was the sound of her world breaking apart. Diane tried to pivot, her voice rising in a frantic, high-pitched defense. She pointed toward the hallway, claiming there was a misunderstanding and that the nanny was just in the other room. She tried to blame me, telling the officers that I had always had a vivid imagination and that I was simply trying to get attention. But Karen didn't argue with her. She simply nodded to the technical officer who had entered behind them. The slideshow of the Eiffel Tower and the Tuscan vineyards suddenly flickered and died. In its place, the screen was filled with a grainy, poorly lit video from an old iPad. The room was suddenly filled with the sound of my own voice, but it wasn't the voice of the girl they saw in the Instagram photos. It was the sound of an 11-year-old child sitting in the dark, sobbing as she tried to break the dry noodle bricks because she didn't know when she would be allowed to eat again. The guests watched in horrified silence as the video changed to a recording of the call from Santorini. They heard Diane's voice, cold and filled with venom, threatening to ship me off to a boarding school if I didn't stop embarrassing her with my hunger. They heard her call me a demon and a liar while the background noise of their luxury vacation played in the distance. The contrast was physically painful. To see the woman in the silk dress screaming at a starving child while she sipped wine in paradise was more than anyone in that room could stomach. The disgust was palpable, a heavy wave of revulsion that swept through the crowd. Martha Keller, the woman Diane considered her best friend, stepped forward with a face twisted in shock and anger. Without a word, she delivered a sharp slap across Diane's cheek. She called Diane a monster and asked how any human being could treat their own blood with such calculated cruelty. The end came quickly after that. Diane tried to turn on my father, shouting that it was his fault for not checking on me, but Greg just stood there with his head bowed, a broken, cowardly man who had finally run out of excuses. They were led out of the house in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. As they were moved toward the waiting patrol cars, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the neighborhood, casting a rhythmic, clinical light over the manicured lawn. I stood at Mr. Harold's window, watching the two people who were supposed to be my protectors being taken away in the back of a police cruiser. There was no joy in the moment, only a profound sense of relief. The mission was over. The truth had been spoken, and the person who had tried to make me invisible was now the only thing everyone was looking at. The last thing I heard as they were led away was the distinct, metallic sound of the handcuffs clicking shut, a sharp and final rhythm that signaled the end of the Jones family mirage. I finally was able to breathe a sigh of relief, the air feeling cleaner than it had in years. The house of mirrors had collapsed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one hiding in the shadows. The living room at Aunt Ruth's house smelled like lavender and old books, a world away from the sterile, staged scent of the house in Denver. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to sit perfectly still or worry about ruining the aesthetic of a room. Aunt Ruth sat across from me, her presence quiet and steady, like a lighthouse after a long storm at sea. It had been a week since the flashing lights and the cold click of handcuffs ended the life I had known. The legal process was moving fast, a whirlwind of documents and sterile offices, but today was the first time I had to hear her voice again. My mother didn't call me directly. She couldn't because of the protective orders. Instead, her voice came through a speaker on a lawyer's desk, echoing into the small, cozy room. She wasn't crying for me. She wasn't asking if the nightmares had stopped or if I was finally eating 3 meals a day. She was sobbing because her real estate license was under review and her reputation in the community was in tatters. "Anna, please," she gasped, her voice sounding thin and desperate over the line. "I was just tired, honey. I made a mistake. I love you so much. You have to tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. You are destroying everything we worked for." I looked down at the small, jagged scar on my thumb, a reminder of the night I had cut myself trying to open a can of expired soup in the dark. That scar was a physical mark of her indifference, a map of where her love had failed. I felt a wave of cold clarity wash over me as I listened to her. She didn't love me. She loved the version of me that looked good in a filtered photo. She loved the idea of being a mother, but she hated the reality of having a daughter who had needs and feelings. I realized then that her tears were just another performance, a final attempt to edit the script of our lives so she could come out as the victim once again. I looked at the phone and felt a strange sense of distance, as if I were listening to a stranger plead for a life that was never actually real. I felt no guilt, only a profound sense of exhaustion that had finally turned into a firm, unyielding resolve. I took a deep breath, feeling the steady weight of my own voice for the first time in years. "You didn't forget to activate that card, Mom," I said, and my voice sounded older than 18, let alone 11. "You just didn't care if I lived or died as long as you got your photos in Paris. I was never your daughter. I was never a real part of your life. I was just an accessory, a piece of jewelry you wore when it suited the outfit and tossed in a drawer when it got in the way." I told the lawyer right then that I wanted every bridge burned. I requested a total termination of parental rights and a permanent no-contact order. I didn't want her letters, her emails, or her hollow apologies. People might call it harsh, but for me, it was the only way to finally breathe. It wasn't about getting back at them. It was about finally being safe. I was choosing to protect the girl who had spent 22 days waiting for a rescue that never came from her own parents. I was drawing a line in the sand and deciding that I would never be a prop in someone else's life ever again. The legal fallout was a slow, heavy collapse of the empire Diane and Greg had built on a foundation of lies. The court system was unforgiving once the truth was laid bare. Because of the scale of the neglect and the digital evidence I had gathered, the judge moved to terminate their rights almost immediately. But the justice didn't stop there. The college fund my grandmother had set aside for me, something my mother had tried to dip into for years, was frozen and placed into a protected trust that they could never touch. They had spent over $47,000 on a single month of luxury, but now they were facing legal fees and fines that far exceeded their savings. To pay for their defense and the restitution the court ordered, they were forced to sell the 2-story house, the stage where so many of my darkest moments had played out. I watched the news one evening and saw a brief clip of them leaving the courthouse, their heads bowed, their faces stripped of the filters and the glamour. They were leaving Colorado with criminal records that would follow them forever. The house of mirrors had finally shattered, and there was no one left to sweep up the glass. When the call ended and the lawyers left, the silence that remained was different. It wasn't the heavy, frightening silence of the empty house in Denver. It was a soft, expectant quiet. Aunt Ruth walked into the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, topped with real whipped cream. She didn't offer me a grand speech or a trip to a foreign city. She just sat down next to me and opened a simple paper calendar she had bought at the grocery store. She pointed to a date 3 weeks away. "This is your school play," she said softly. "And this date here is your checkup with the doctor. And this one is just for us to go get ice cream." I am marking them all down, Anna. I am marking them so I never forget where you are or what you need. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to sign my own permission slips or remind someone that I existed. I had a base, a real home where I was seen for who I actually was, not how I looked in a viewfinder. I realized that my value wasn't a debt I owed to the people who gave me life. It was a gift I gave to myself. I was finally allowed to be a child, and in the quiet warmth of Aunt Ruth's living room, I finally felt the weight of the world start to lift. The recovery was not a straight line, but I was no longer walking it alone. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the phantom ache of hunger or checking the door locks 5 times before I could sleep. But every morning, the calendar was there on the fridge, a steady reminder that I was no longer invisible. Aunt Ruth taught me that love was found in the small things, like the way she remembered exactly how I liked my breakfast, or the way she actually listened when I talked about my day. I began to understand that family was a choice we make every day, a commitment to show up and stay when things get difficult. My parents had chosen themselves, but I was choosing a new path. I was learning to forgive the girl I used to be for not being strong enough to leave sooner. And I was learning that being brave meant having the courage to walk away from people who didn't see my worth. I was finally standing on my own 2 feet, supported by a love that didn't need a camera to be real. Dr. Reeves, the psychologist who helped me through those first few months, told me that forgiveness wasn't a debt I owed to the people who hurt me. It was something I did for my own peace. And as I sat there with my cocoa, watching Aunt Ruth mark another important date on the calendar, I realized I had already started that journey. The morning air at Fort Carson is crisp and thin, a sharp reminder that I am standing at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, far away from the stifling atmosphere of that house in Denver. As I sit in my barracks, the sunlight filtering through the window catches the polished surface of my boots and the crisp lines of my uniform. On my lap sit 2 pieces of paper that represent a lifetime of struggle. One is a yellowed letter from 7 years ago, filled with the sharp, jagged words of a mother who saw my survival as a personal insult to her reputation. The other is a fresh envelope, sent just last week, filled with a fragile, hollow apology and a plea for a connection that she finally realizes she needs. I hold them for a moment, feeling the weight of the past, and then I place them back into my locker. I do not pick up a pen. I do not dial a number. In the military, we have a term for this: radio silence. It is not an act of anger, and it is not a sign of weakness. It is a tactical decision to protect the peace I have fought so hard to secure. I have learned that I do not owe my presence to people who only valued my absence. By staying silent, I am finally the one in control of the narrative. Family used to be a word that made my stomach tighten with a familiar, hollow ache. It used to mean matching outfits, curated smiles, and a $20 bill tossed onto a marble counter like a scrap of garbage. But as I look at the photos pinned to the inside of my locker, I see what family actually looks like. It is Mr. Harold, who still sends me care packages filled with the same brand of pasta sauce that saved my life. It is Mrs. Patterson, who eventually became one of my biggest advocates and still emails me to ask how my training is going. And most of all, it is Aunt Ruth, the woman who took a broken, invisible girl and showed her that she was worth the ink on a calendar. These are the people who didn't need a filtered photo to see me. They didn't need a public audience to offer a hand. They showed up in the dark, and they stayed when the lights stayed off. Standing here among my fellow soldiers, men and women who would literally walk through fire to ensure I make it home, I finally understand that true loyalty is written in actions, not in the captions of a social media post. We are a different kind of family, one built on the unshakable foundation of shared sacrifice and genuine care. I often think about that 11-year-old girl standing in the middle of a beautiful, empty house, trying to figure out how to survive on 66 cents a day. For a long time, I hated her. I hated her for being small, for being hungry, and for being so desperate for the love of people who didn't deserve her. But now, as a soldier in the United States Army, I see her differently. That survival mission was my first true training. It taught me the kind of discipline that cannot be lectured. It must be lived. It taught me how to find strength in the silence and how to keep moving forward when every instinct tells you to give up. The nightmare of those 30 days didn't break me. It forged me. It turned my vulnerability into a weapon and my trauma into a shield. I'm no longer the victim of Diane Jones. I am the victor of my own life. If I could reach back through time and speak to that shivering girl in the dark kitchen, I would pull her close and tell her that she is doing just fine. I would tell her that her hunger is temporary, but her resilience is permanent. I would tell her to keep recording, to keep speaking, because the truth is the only thing that will eventually set her free. The mission that started with a locked credit card and a month of abandonment is finally complete. My parents left me with a useless piece of plastic and a legacy of neglect, but I have reclaimed every inch of my soul. I have built a life that is entirely my own, one that doesn't require the validation of a camera lens or the approval of a narcissist. As the bugle calls across the base and the sun begins to climb over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep purple, I stand at attention with my head held high. I can feel the strength in my limbs and the peace in my heart. The Jones family mirage is a ghost of the past, a story that no longer has the power to hurt me. I am Anna Jones, a soldier, a survivor, and a woman who finally knows her own worth. I have done the hard work of healing, and I have found the courage to leave the deserters behind. I will never again be a prop in someone else's theater. As I step out onto the field for morning formation, I realize that the mission didn't just end. It gave me the tools to start a new one. And this time, I am the commander of my own destiny. And I will never desert my own life again. The story of Anna Jones offers a profound lesson on the true nature of resilience and the redefinition of family. Her journey reminds us that an individual's worth is never determined by those who fail to see it, even when those people are their own parents. Resilience is more than just enduring neglect. It is the courageous act of reclaiming one's narrative through the power of truth and discipline. We learned that family is not merely a matter of blood, but a sacred commitment of action, presence, and loyalty. Ultimately, setting firm boundaries is not an act of revenge, but a vital step towards self-preservation and peace. We hope Anna's transformation from an invisible child into a resilient soldier has inspired you to recognize the strength within your own soul. Stories like hers remind us that no matter how dark the night, a new dawn is always possible when we choose to stand for the truth. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever found strength in a chosen family? Or have you had to set a difficult boundary for your own healing? Please share your experiences and reflections in the comments below. If this journey moved you, please like this video and subscribe to join our community. Your support helps us tell the stories that need to be heard.